Hi, I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session. And in this session, we'll be discussing how we can use stories and storytelling to create change in our living human systems. We'll explore how stories make, prop up, and bring down our systems. My guest for today will share about her knowledge and experience of how stories shape the way we understand the world, our place in it, and our ability to change it. And her name is Ella Saltmarshe. Ella has a deep practical grounding in both narrative and systems change. She writes drama for stage and screen and is represented by the agency. She co-founded The Point People, which works on systems change across sectors, the Comms Lab, a systems change lab focused on the advertising industry, the Long Time Project that focuses on shifting foundational narratives to foster responsibility for the long-term future of the planet, and a range of creative campaigning initiatives, including SHEvotes, RepresentAge, and Time to Vote. Her work on creativity and innovation has been published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, The Guardian, Fast Company, The Financial Times, and Creative Review. And today she's here. A very warm welcome to you, Ella. Thank you so much for being here with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit.
Great. Thank you very much for having me, Jennifer. I'm excited to be here and to dive into the role of story in systems change.
Yes. And let's just straight dive into that story. And I'd like to know, why did you write, for example, an article about how we can use story to create systems change?
Well, I've always had these parallel tracks in my career. So part of my work has been focused on story, writing drama for stage and screen, and being very practically immersed in creating narratives. And then the other part of my work has been about how we work with systems. And so I've co-founded different organizations, and I'm kind of deep into this work of building the field for systems change, but also being very practical and doing it at scale. And over recent years, I've started to see the ways that these two worlds can combine. And I found myself noticing all these different roles that I saw story playing in the work of systems change. And I couldn't see anybody writing about it. And so I thought, well, let's see if this is useful to people. And so what actually began as an article that I thought would take me a couple of days to write ended up it becoming a much bigger project that took the best part of a year, and led me to speak to many different kinds of practitioners, because I really wanted to showcase the exciting work that's already happening in this space, but also to help people get more nuanced around how they use narrative, to really understand the different ways that we can use story to change the systems that we live in.
Yes. So actually what you're saying is that it started from your personal work system, where you had different tracks that came together and that merged for you. And amongst other contexts, it landed in a bigger project of an article that at least was the onset for me to get familiar with your work and why we're talking here today. And what I find really interesting is that you say there is a story in the systemic and no one was writing about it. So you wrote about it. And so could you share with us, what is the story of the systemic, and how can story be used to actually tell the story of the systemic?
Yeah, so when thinking about systems, I often come back to Donella Meadows, because she's been so foundational in this space. And in her work on the different leverage points to intervene to change a system, she talks about how the kind of most impactful leverage point is when you can change the purpose of a system, when you can change the values, the mindsets, and the goals of a system. And story is foundational for that. You know, stories lock systems in place with our hearts and minds. They make systems feel eternal and immutable, and we can change those narratives. And by changing those narratives, we can unlock systems. So I think that's the meta answer.
Yeah.
But then there are many very practical ways that we can use story to get systemic, and I'm sure we'll dive into those during the course of this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I love that, how you say that stories lock in systems and tie them to what we know from like as human beings, we love stories so much. And usually it's about also making things or people almost immortal because of the locking in, because all the purpose, belief systems and things that drive our behavior and drive how we show up in the world are tied into story. So how we give meaning then to why are we here as an organization, for example, organizational system gets locked into the story. That's what I understand from you. Oh, that's fascinating.
Absolutely. And we've always done it. Like throughout our history, we have created stories to prop up the systems that we live in. Yeah. So, you know, when we first started gathering together in large urban civilizations, you know, the only way we could make that work was by developing myths that justified hierarchy. There was no way we could live together in groups if we didn't start to develop these collective stories that justified the systems of government that was needed to organize us living en masse. So we've always done this. But the problem about story but also the power of it is that there's a saying that story is for humans like water is for fish. It is the thing that we swim in. It is the thing that is essential to us, but we cannot see it. It is invisible to us. And so story is this insanely potent, powerful force, but we don't see it. And as we'll explore in this conversation, part of the work of using it systemically is enabling us to see the stories that we are living by.
Yeah. What I find so interesting is in what you're saying is that the stories to us are like water to the fish, and actually that's an analogy that we also use in the Systemic Leadership Summit to explain what is the systemic and what is such a big influence on us, and why it's so important that we start seeing it, so that we understand the influence on our behavior and possibilities or impossibilities for roles within systems. So actually tying that together with what you just said is that story is innately systemic. It carries a lot of connection. It carries a lot of what pulls us together, like you just mentioned before. How could we work or justify certain decisions that were actually made on some point to work with hierarchy, and that the story is a lever for that the story carries us into that change. And so if we look at the role of story in, for example, the complex times that we live in today, where change is a constant, it's exponential, and it's becoming more and more complex, how can story play a role in creating systems change?
Well, I like to think of these three different ways of understanding how story can help in systems change. And I talk about story as light, story as glue, and story as web. And so when I talk about story as light, I'm talking about the illuminating capacity of story, the way that story enables us to see the cracks in a system, to see the outliers who are already creating change, and to build a narrative around that adds momentum to that change, to the way it can shine a light on the future and on possible futures. So that's the kind of illuminating power of story as light. Then there's story as glue, which is about the cohering power of story. So that's really about how do we use story to build the movements, the communities, the networks that are foundational in systems change. And then the last part of the criteria is story as web.
Yeah.
So that's really about the nest of narratives that we live in on a personal, cultural, and mythic level. So that's the way that I am trying to help people understand some of the different ways we can use story. Story as light, story as glue, and story as web.
Right. Wow, that's an interesting three very distinct and strong qualities, and love to go into them with you, especially if we could use some examples of the three and how that works, and maybe from your own companies or that you founded, and how you use them as light or as glue, as web, or some other examples that you also shared in your article to really illustrate that. So could you open up the story as light with an example?
Sure. So as I said, like, story as light is really about this incredible capacity of story to shine a light on different aspects of a system. Mm-hmm. And we know that a big part of systems change is about seeing the system.
Yeah.
And so story can play an incredible role in showing the destructive parts of a system, the fault lines, the cracks, the parts of a system that aren't working. Yeah. And actually the rise of interactive storytelling, the fact we're having all these new, more immersive storytelling technologies is really helping this kind of storytelling. So you'll see it done by investigative journalists, for example. Mm-hmm. So there have been some incredible New York Times, ProPublica, multimedia pieces that help show all the different elements that are contributing to an issue. One of the projects I'm a big fan of is the Guardian's Modern Day Slavery Project.
Yeah.
Because what they do very well is they show the system. They have compelling personal stories, but then they talk about the causes and they talk about possible solutions.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to flag up here that we need to be wide-angled when we are telling systemic stories. And what that means is that, yes, we need the compelling personal stories, but we also need those to be connected to the causes of the problem and the possible solutions. And I think something that I see campaigners doing a lot is focusing on compelling personal stories.
Yeah.
Because they know, how emotional and how moving they are, but not then talking about the wider causes of a problem and the possible solutions.
Okay.
So that's the kind of part of story as light that's about illuminating the fault lines in a system. But then, another key part of systems change is cohering outliers. There's that saying by William Gibson that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And so, for example, some of the work that we've done at the Comms Lab, which is an organization I've set up to help transform the advertising industry, we really shine a light on people who are doing brilliant work at the edges. We bring them into the center, and then we connect them to others who are also doing groundbreaking work, so that we can start to build a narrative that there is a movement of people who are changing the industry. Yeah. And so that's another way that we're using this illuminating power of story. And then the final one is about thinking about the future. And looking at how we can work with story to help people think into the future, but using their emotions, not in an abstract way, so that they think about possible futures and then change the way that they act in the present. They think about the way a system might look in the future. So in the article, I cite a project that was done with kind of different stakeholders in the agriculture sector in Singapore, and the organization Forum for the Future worked with a theatre producer to create a situation that was the Nobel Nobel Peace Prize in 2030.
Mm-hmm.
And the Nobel Peace Prize was going to go to someone who'd pioneered a form of agriculture. And so that group of stakeholders had to pretend, they walked into the context as if they were actors in a play of being in 2030 and thinking about, well, what as judges are we going to be awarding? What's going to be there that's worth us giving the Nobel Prize to? And so that very inspiring exercise then helped them come back to their situation in the present and collectively start to think about, well, how does the system that we're working in need to change so that those kinds of innovations are going to be possible?
Right.
So there are a few different examples of Story as Light.
Yeah, and thank you so much for those. So let me just reiterate these back to you, because we are talking about story as light, and thank you so much for the different examples. And what I hear you say is that there are actually at least three different ways of looking at story as light. One is about story as really looking at problems and causes of problems, and not just focusing on what are compelling individual stories, but to actually look at or invite people to look at what are root causes, what is the bigger picture, why is the system the way it is, and what can we do to change the bigger problem that we are shining light on. Then there is a category of looking at the outliers, people who working on different projects or different aspects that deserve to be in the spotlight so that they can emerge on whatever they are working on, and that could be of value to the bigger collective. And then I hear you say there's also a way of shining light to work towards the future and to really step into the future and bring back what we've learned of what we've seen, to then translate that into, well, what are the consequences if we want to create those futures or those possibilities. What does it mean for the here and now? And so what I find so fascinating about what you just explained with the different examples is that many people are not taught or used to using story as light. We are usually on the consuming end of stories. And so marketing is a very big example of that you just mentioned, how stories are used to compel us to buy things or to consume things or to witness things, but not to be activated in any of the areas that you mentioned. And it reminds me of the countless hours where we sit and binge watch on Netflix or anywhere else. And we consume the stories of individuals, but we do not, we hardly have an invitation to the bigger systems and to look at the bigger systems. So that's why I love this angle that you take on story as light. So thank you for the examples.
And I think it's worth, you mentioned binging on Netflix and things, and actually I'm quite excited by seeing more systemic storytelling in popular culture, because I think one of the aspects of this idea of story as light is stories that help us understand how a problem looks from different perspectives, and then connect it to the wider causes and possible solutions. And so we're seeing things like the latest season of Serial, which is all about the US justice system, which is very systemic. It's having each episode tells these kind of heartbreaking personal stories, but it's connecting it to the wider causes of the problem, as well as possible solutions. Even if you take something like Narcos, a kind of, a Netflix drama, but actually what each episode does is it then takes a step back and it will connect us to the wider kind of macroeconomic and political dynamics that were happening alongside these personal stories. Right. And so I think and then when you come into some of these really exciting interactive pieces that I've been talking about, which really allow for many different voices to be heard. I think in popular culture, we are definitely seeing the rise of more systemic storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we are entering an age where we are all storytellers, whether that's through our Instagram feeds, what we share on Facebook, on Snapchat. And so it is going to become increasingly relevant. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, and I do want to get into the examples of a story as glue and story as web, but now we're speaking about it. I think there is also, with the storytelling comes a certain responsibility that, because you're mentioning Instagram and Snapchat and some other social media where there's also spaces for us to share our stories. And what pops up for me is that brings a certain responsibility also in terms of, what am I sharing? Am I sharing just to show the world about my individual life and that's it? Or do I share because I want to make a statement about what I see happening in our systems, and to shine a light on that and to see what my viewpoint is and to welcome other viewpoints, to have a more systemic exchange and discussion about it. So while we're in the realm of the social media, I think there's also hopefully a growing awareness of our impact of the stories that we put out there.
Absolutely. And I think you raise a really interesting question, which I've never thought about, which is what would a systemic Instagram account look like?
Mm-hmm.
I know people who are doing very interesting things on Instagram, are challenging norms, are challenging privilege, are building community. So they're doing lots of elements of the work of systems change. But I think it's a really interesting question about how would you curate your own, because I think I curate my own feed, so it's quite systemic, but what would an account be that was truly telling systemic stories via these different mediums? It's a great question.
Yeah, well, it's something that I've been thinking about, because the setting of the Systemic Leadership Summit, it brings together different voices, but it's still in a format that is, one, very familiar to people, and two, as a creator and host, I shape it. And so I've been thinking about, what if we create a setting where everyone is creating and everyone is shaping and everyone is exchanging input, and how could we facilitate that? So that's why it pops up for me now. It's very much on my mind, how to facilitate that through the modern channels that we have nowadays, and to bring in more people from across the world, and that's just easier to do now they have the social media in place. It certainly doesn't replace the live way of exchanging story and creating systemic change. But it's the next best thing, because more people can join because of the technology that we have now.
Absolutely.
I'd love to move into examples of story as glue. I think that was the next one, and then we have web. So do you have more examples of those?
So story as glue is all about this cohering power of story. Story is the best tool that we have for communicating empathy. Mm-hmm. It literally enables us to step into other people's shoes.
Yeah.
And so that has different applications when we're looking at changing systems. So one application is, it really helps us to build bridges across difference. So the work of systems change often involves bringing together groups of people who occupy very different and perhaps conflicting places in a system, to rethink how that system operates. And in order for them to do that, they have to be able to build bridges with each other.
Yeah.
And story is a tool to help do that. And so, in many of these kind of multi-stakeholder meetings, we'll start by getting people to tell personal stories of how they came into this work, personal stories of the first time they remember taking action on something that mattered to them. And so we start to get them to relate to each other as passionate humans first, and then as people who hold different opinions. And so the kind of the way that story communicates empathy is really important for bridging difference. And then there's the cohering power of story in building the movements and communities and networks that we need for systems change. So we need collective stories to help galvanize us. And those stories need to be woven in a way that they give people enough space to include their personal stories. And so this work is inspired by what people like Marshall Gantz have done around public narrative. And that's really looking at how do you weave stories of self into stories of us, into stories of the system. And ensuring that people are able to connect their personal stories to the systemic. Because ultimately, if we're going to have impact, that's going to be essential.
Yeah. And so actually what you're saying is, in these examples, is that when we look at story as glue, it's about connecting the smaller systems to the larger system and back again. Because if I'm able to share my story with others in the group or team or the setting that I'm in, and we have a bigger narrative in which I can still share my story, and it fits the bigger umbrella story, so to speak, then what I can do is mirror my story to the bigger system and back again. And so it does a number of things that pop up for me now, is that the isomorphic quality of systems, we are actually nested systems in the bigger system. And so story can help us use the narrative language to actually see how we're glued together, how it mirrors out, what that looks like. It makes it very tangible and concrete. Because we have language now, we have something that we can communicate about, and that makes it really easy for us to step into and see the connection. It also reminds me of when there's disconnect. For example, I see that in a lot of organizations where I work with leaders and are trying to implement change, that the narrative is broken because the bigger story of the organization is either not clear or is quite a different one than of the individuals. And they just feel like, okay, I work individually with my clients, or I work with patients as a nurse, or I do this or I do that. And I don't feel the resonance with the bigger things so much. So that's where the quality of the glue that you talk about comes in. Wow, fascinating. And so, does the glue always stick?
Oh, absolutely not. No, I mean, the glue doesn't always stick. And I think it's easy to talk about this, but in practice, it's very delicate, this work, because you want to have a story that is motivating and mobilizing, but you don't want to impose narrative either. So it's this story that is kind of loose enough and tight enough. It is loose enough so that people feel like it is their choice to pick it up, and that there is a space for them in it, but it is tight enough so that it is galvanizing and cohering. And so, I mean, just look around all the time. We are seeing, we're seeing campaigns that don't effectively use story. Often it's because they're very tightly controlled. So something that we did a few years ago was a campaign called SHEvotes, which was a campaign that we pulled together very rapidly when we had this snap general election in the UK. So we had an election that was called with 6 weeks' notice. This was 2 years ago. And it's a time in our country. I mean, we're having this conversation the day after the Brexit vote has not gone through our House of Commons in the UK. So it's a very, very important time in the future of our country right now. And this previous election was incredibly important. And so many of us were very concerned about this rushed timing and really wanted to ensure that young people's voices were going to be heard in the campaign, given that it was about their future. And but we didn't have any time, we didn't have any money, and so with 3 weeks to go, so midway through the 6-week campaign, we ran something that we called an emergency election hack, where we brought together people working in advertising, entertainment, and PR. We gave them a brief, and we decided to focus on young women and voting. Yeah, because we found out this shocking fact that young women were the least likely demographic to vote in the UK. Yeah, and so we gave this group this brief, and then they went off and they created all these different kinds of pieces of content and T-shirts and kind of comedy videos. And then the next morning we woke up and we realized that actually this was a thing. It needed a name, so we called it SHEvotes. The insight was that young women were the least likely demographic to vote. And then we ran this open sourced campaign where we asked anybody to create content. And so we had bakers making SHEvotes donuts. We had nail bars doing SHEvotes manicures. But we also opened the campaign up to any platform that wanted to take it, which meant that platforms made it their own. So we had kind of intersectional feminist zines doing their version of SHEvotes, whilst we had Cosmo doing its version of SHEvotes. Yeah. And because we didn't have an organizational brand to protect, we didn't care. We didn't care what people did with this story. We just wanted it to be in as many places as possible, so as many different kinds of young women saw that message and voted. And it ended up being an insanely successful campaign just in terms of reach. So, you know, we reached like over 50 million people in a campaign that was only live for a week and barely had a budget. And I think the success of that campaign was partly because we did not hold that story lightly. I mean, we didn't hold that story tightly. We let people be free with it. We let them make it their own. And I think there's something to learn from that, because very often campaigns try and hold their brand tightly. They try and hold their story tightly. It's often about, you know, there's an organization that will want to get more funding perhaps for this particular campaign, so it has to feel like it's their campaign. But actually, for something to be successful, we also have to let it go.
Yeah. And the letting go, because we are talking about story as glue and whether it sticks or not. And there's an example of where there was a lot of sticking by letting go. And I find that so fascinating. It's like it's a paradox, but actually it's not. It reminds me of one of my systemic approach teachers who said you can't really let go of anything that you never grasped in the first place. And the letting go has to do with purpose. And what you just mentioned there is when you have a brand to protect, then you're focusing on the brand. You're not focusing on the cause. You're not focusing on what you actually want to accomplish with the story. And what I hear you say is that in this example for you, it didn't really matter how it was shaped, as long as you could stay really close to the purpose of reaching young women and encouraging them to vote as the almost marginalized group when it comes to a very important voting process in your country, and the implications of what their non-voting may have on the outcomes of that election at that point. So I find it fascinating also that if you want to use story as glue, is that what's the purpose of what you're trying to do with the story. And are you open to all the voices who are also willing to express that story in their own way? So fascinating example.
And I think it's really important to be systemic about why this situation has arisen. Why do we protect stories? Why do we have to protect brands in the way that we do around issues? And that's partly because of the way that change is funded. And so, you will have NGOs that are competing for funds. So they have to make this campaign feel like it's theirs so that they can get more money to keep their work going. And so, some of the work that I've been doing over the last year has been with networks of funders to help them understand actually, like, how do you build ecosystems of change so that you don't have this kind of this almost kind of nihilistic competitive nature in the field of systems, but actually you fund change in different ways that free people up to take more collective approaches. So I think, we have to be very systemic in how we understand what isn't working with the way we use narrative in this work.
Yeah, and it's also about the awareness of the role that you have, because I can imagine that if you work with different funding organizations and there is a decision-making process as to which causes to fund or which campaigns to support, then if you're not inclined to think systemically, or if you're not about creating healthy ecosystems, what your purpose is to influence in a different way, then of course the narrative is going to be used in a different way, and the impact is then different. So what I actually hear you say is that this stakeholder group as funders and working with them is also inviting them into the story of how can we be systemic about it? How can we be aware of our influence in the bigger system when there's so many NGOs who are trying to work towards sometimes really complex things to solve, and they end up being competing against each other instead of really working on the cause that they're trying to apply for funds for. So it's also looking at the bigger industry of how do these players, how do they use story, and what's the purpose of the story. So the story and the purpose and how it can work as glue is I think a very important piece in that. And then we have the third aspect of story, and that is story as a web. I'd love to hear more about that too. How's it different from story as light and story as glue?
So story as web is all about this nest of narratives that we live in. Like we are literally living in a spider's web of narrative with all these invisible threads that we can't see. And often, we are like marionettes to the stories that dominate our lives. And so this work of story as web is looking at how do we firstly become aware of the narratives we're living by, and then how do we reauthor them if we decide that that's something we need to do. And
reauthor them?
Reauthor them.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so how do we tell different stories? And that can happen on a personal, cultural, and a mythic level. So on a personal level, the field of narrative therapy has been doing fantastic work over the last 20 or 30 years in giving very practical tools to people to enable them to see the stories they're living by and to reauthor them. And that work is important in movement building, because very often as individuals, we will be experiencing difficulties in our lives, and we won't see these difficulties as being collective. We will see them as being individualized. So I might be struggling with something and I'll be like, well, it's my fault. I just haven't done a good enough job, or I don't know, it's all about me. Instead of being able to understand how actually, no, it's not my fault. It's about the larger structures that I'm living in. And so we then look at, well, what are the stories that I'm telling about the problem or the issue,
Mm-hmm.
and then what are alternative stories about that problem or issue, and how can I author new stories that are more enabling,
Yeah.
that basically unlock, we come back to this idea of unlocking,
Mm-hmm.
that unlock me from my current relationship with this problem or issue that I have.
Yeah.
So that's the idea of changing the personal web of narrative that we live in.
Hang on with that one, because I think it's really important to stand still just for a second with this piece, because it's big. What we see, what I hear you say is, as individuals, we grow up in our living human systems, and all these systems have stories. And the stories we then internalize and also personalize and say, okay, if there's something that's happening in my life or in my interaction with others in the system I live in the systems that I live in, and I don't like it, then I'm inclined to internalize that and individualize that and say, oh, well, it's my doing. And this is also a bigger story that we have, especially in the Western society, where if there's something that you don't like about your life, then you just need to change it. And if you don't change it, then you just need to sit with the consequences. So there is something inherently interesting about that story that I hear you now say that you can also change and say, if we have systemic awareness and understanding of how our systems are impacting us, then we'll also understand that many of the dynamics that you don't like may not be as personal as you thought they were, but also have a non-personal component and are sit in the collective. And I did want to stress this because it's very important also within the context of our summit, the personal and the non-personal when we talk about systemic. And story helps us to give meaning, but rewriting the story helps us to give different meaning. So I did want to articulate that because I do think it's important.
Absolutely. And this work is very much about how do we unlock the agency in our lives? How do we stop feeling like we are passive recipients of systems and actually start to realize that we are active agents who can change those systems?
Yeah.
And a narrative is key. And I think, I talk about the invisibility of story a lot, because that's where it derives so much of its potency. And so, if we look at, say, capitalism as a system, it is very good at making us feel like our problems are our own fault rather than the fault of the system that we live in. So rather than, try and change access to childcare, we look at how can we how can I get a new mentor so I can balance my childcare needs? So we're constantly looking at these individualized responses because we're blind to the fact that our problems are collective ones. And as soon as we can start connecting our individual experiences to the collective, we can then start to work with others to change the collective. But for as long as we remain blind to the fact that what we think is an individualized problem is a collective one, we are on our own. And it is much harder to find agency and to change things.
And now I'm grasping more the importance of the word unlocking, because what stories do, they have a locking in impact, but they can also help you to unlock. But then you should be willing to change the story then, to step out of the web of the older stories that are not supporting and step into a web of stories that, or rewrite the stories that are more in support of the different life experience that you want to have and probably a bigger collective wants to actually have.
And let's be honest, like, it's very easy to sit here and talk about like rewriting stories and getting rid of old stories. But in practice, the work is messy and tough because these stories are like in us. These old stories are deep within us, and letting go of them is really hard. And authoring new ones is kind of messy and uncertain, and it's going to feel really weird for quite a long time. So I think it's also important to talk about this is messy, deep, tough work that doesn't happen overnight.
No, and thank you for that. In the summit, we're also talking about being in similar places like that, where we are in the liminal, where we are trying to let go of the old and the new's not there yet, and we are in somewhere in between in the nowhere land, and dealing with that, or dealing with overwhelm, which is so much information that we can hardly see the stories behind them and look at, are these the stories that I want to dominate my life or not? So this is, thank you for stressing that it's not easy and that it's messy, because this is also the space where many leaders in organizations or communities, or any one of us, anyone who's watching also, can find themselves in nowadays, because there's so much change going on to begin with. So I love about the story of web, how we can be caught in the old web, as I call it now, the older web of stories, because we identify ourselves with the stories. We define ourselves by the stories. And so that's why it's such hard work. If you define yourself as, oh, I'm not able to do that, or this is how I was brought up, or this is how we function as a family, or this is how we do things as an organization, those currents, those stories are so strong that it feels like we're not able to change that. And actually we are. What we do need the connections with other people to help us with changing the story. So
absolutely, and we need, it's a process, and we need support. And as you said, we need to get comfortable with the messiness of all of this work. Like, anyone who presents the work of systemic change as being neat and easy and clean isn't telling the whole story. This work is inherently messy and uncertain and emotionally challenging, and so all of us as practitioners have to develop tools and develop ways of navigating this world.
So now that we and this is an onset to a next piece I want to discuss with you before we wrap up the story of our conversation in this summit. And that is, so we talked about story as light, story as glue, and story as web. And now I want to go to us, as we are sitting here, as many of you are watching, as people who want to shape leadership more systemically, us as storytellers and as listeners to stories. What is it that you recommend that we do differently, knowing that we all tell stories in our own ways? We hold stories and consciously or unconsciously work with them. We tell stories to ourselves, and we enhance stories in the context that we are in. So with all that we've discussed today, what would you recommend if we want to create systemic change with stories? Where do we start?
I think a good place to start is with yourself. And so to start to become aware of the stories that you're living by. Literally write a list. To sit down and think about, like, what are the dominant stories in my life? Or what are the stories that I feel like are dominating my life? And just start to become clear on that. And then you can look at the issue that you are working on or the system that you're working in and start to think about your relationship to that system. So why am I doing this? What is the story of me doing this work?
Mm-hmm.
And go back as early as you can. You know, what's the earliest memory you have of something that shows why you're seeking to do this work today? Because as we've said, this work is tough, and you are going to need to know how it relates to the bigger story of your life to keep going with it. So at a very basic level, I'd say start with yourself and your relationship to the system that you are seeking to influence and the story that you have around that.
Yeah.
Then when you're diving more deeply into the system that you're working in, really start to look at what are the stories around the fault lines and cracks? You know, how do I tell that story? Or perhaps your role is, how do I start to tell stories around the outliers and innovators? Or perhaps, you know, we all occupy so many different roles when it comes to systems that I'm not going to give like one off the shelf like way you should use story, because the reason I'm doing this work is to say, depending on the nature of your work, you will want to use story in different ways. You know, if you are a movement builder, you're going to be wanting to use the cohering power of story. If you're a journalist, you're probably going to be using story as light more. You know, if you're a narrative analyst, you're going to be diving into the work of story as web. So I guess initially just for people to educate themselves about the different roles that story can play, so that they can start to see the ones that are most relevant to the work that they are trying to do in the systems they are seeking to influence.
Yeah. So it starts with yourself, with your own stories that are key in your life, and then the stories that are related to the context or the problem, or both of them, that you find yourself in, the system that you would like to influence, where you'd like to create or co-create change. And then also to look at which role or function do I want story to play in relationship to the role that I hold in this context, and how can I then use it effectively, starting with myself.
Because story is like a toolbox that contains one tool. And it is one tool that does many different things. So it can be a hammer, a spanner, a wrench. But if we don't know about all these different applications, we will just use this tool that we have in one way, in the way that we know. And so that's why I think it's really important to start to get nuanced about all the different things you can do with this tool, so that you can use it more wisely in your context.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I have one more question for you, Ella, before we close off. And that you just encouraged our viewers to start with yourself if you want to use story to create change in the systems you work and live in. And I'd like to ask you about you. And that has to do with the experience that you had with story and with founding your own companies and change labs. How did that impact the systems that you are part of, starting with your own, just yourself?
Yeah, so I grew up on a very remote farm without any television. And so I spent my early years immersed in story. I just read voraciously. And the stories that I loved as a child were stories of the rebel princesses. They were stories of particularly girls and women who were breaking the norms. And so I think as a young age, those stories gave me a sense of permission and empowered me to actually start to break free of certain systems. And that continued, into my teenage years, where I've become, obsessed by the autobiographies of people who had led lives that had challenged norms, that had changed things in the world.
Yeah.
And so I think I guess I've led my life in quite a countercultural way, and have constantly resisted being sucked into certain systems. And the things that have empowered me to do that have always been stories.
Yeah.
And so on a very personal level, stories give me agency. They inspire me as to what is possible. They help me lead a life that looks very different from the norm. And I see that now as a woman who is aging. I'm very aware of how we look at older women in public life and the kinds of stories that we have about that, the way that older women are represented on stages and screens. And it's not great. And so that's one of the reasons that I've started this RepresentAge campaign, which is all about changing the way we represent age. And so I think on very personal levels, I'm super aware of the role that story plays, but also in my agency to start to reauthor some of those stories.
Yeah.
And of course, yes, then in all the work that I do around systems change, narrative is foundational. It will take hours if we dive into all the different ways that I use it now. But it is my starting point.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that also. And especially what fascinates me is that you say that story from a very young age has become a way for you to be really conscious about what systems you find yourself in, and if you want to stay in them, and if so, where you can use story to change them, or to be in systems that actually allow you to be yourself, regardless of where you find yourself in life or at what age you are.
And I'd say, thinking about the challenging nature of the work of systems change and the liminal spaces and the uncertainty and the overwhelm, I would really recommend that people find stories that will support them through that. Whether that's biographies and autobiographies of people who have led lives that have challenged norms, or whether they're fictional stories, like whatever it takes to resource and support you through the uncertainty and messiness of this work. Like that narrative is so many things, but it can also be a cushion. It can be, I haven't talked about the role of narrative as duvet, narrative as safe place.
Yeah.
Narrative is something that sustains and resources us through the difficult parts of our work. And we might need to seek out those stories because they're not always the ones presented to us.
Yeah. Ella, we have come to the end of our conversation, and we talked about using the story to change systems, and the different aspects and ways that we can work with story, tell stories to really impact the systems that we're part of, but also our experience of the systems we are in. Whether we are trying to tackle a problem, whether we want to take voices out of marginalized spaces, whether we want to address root causes of issues, whether we want to create more connectedness, or whether we want to find a space where there is comfort when there is turbulence and chaos. So thank you so much for this conversation, Ella. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure that there's many other things that I will take away from this conversation when I see it again in the summit. Thank you so much for being on.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for weaving together all these different stories to enable people to dive into this world of systems. I think bringing together very different voices is so key. So, yeah, a huge thank you for doing this.
Thank you, and you're welcome. And to everyone who's been watching and listening, I'd almost like to invite you and say, what were the stories that popped up for you when you were watching this? So what were the narratives that came up when you listened to LME talk about using story to change systems? I'd love to hear from you in our online community space. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again so much for watching. Take care. See you in the next session. Bye-bye.